Hey, David Raffhoff here with another video on JavaScript basics. Hope you're having a good day and thanks for joining me. Today I'm going to be going through how to work with objects and just different ways you can go about creating them, updating them, adding keys and values or moving them, and then just kind of some modern approaches to working with objects. It's tempting to jump ahead and start looking into things like classes, but I think without really understanding how objects work, it's just going to be too difficult. You'll be missing a lot about how classes work with JavaScript. So all of this is based off of ES6 or kind of what I would consider like modern JavaScript. But yeah, look forward to going through this with you. I'm just going to share my screen here and get right into it. So if you haven't seen my first video on the absolute basics of JavaScript, check out the description below for a link to that. But I'm going to assume you've seen all that, so I'm not going to cover any of that here. And I'm just going to be using Code Sandbox, and I'll also provide a link to this code in the description if you're curious. But yeah, what we have here on the left is where we're going to be writing our code. And then primarily I'm just going to be writing things out to the console over here and looking at problems. So I'm not expecting to output much here in this browser. So I'll just cover quickly, a couple ways you can declare an object and assign a value. So here we could make an example object, and we'll just make it an empty object. And if we want to log that out, we can see what that's going to look like. And you can see over here we're just getting an empty object. Now we can go in here and just add an actual key and a value, and that'll go ahead and show up over here. And if we expand that, you'll see the key on the left and with a colon, and that's just denoting it's a key. And then on the right there's the value that we have assigned to. One thing that might be a little surprising about this is constant is referring to a constant declaration, not a constant value. So for example, we can come in here and we can say example dot a is equal to 5. And now when we do this console.log, you can see that that example object has been updated. And similarly, if we wanted, we could update the object like this, or sorry, the key's value like this. So you can use square brackets with a string for the key, or you can just use the dot syntax or dot notation to set a key directly. And then another way that you can declare an object is just to use let. So we could say let, we could just change this to let example equals what we had before. And again, when we output the value there, we're going to see it's updated from 2 to 5. But the other interesting thing we can do with let is we can, since our declaration is not constant, we can just set a totally different object there. And you'll see below that we have b set to 3. I'm not sure what it's complaining about here. Yeah, so anyway, that's just the ways that you would declare and assign a value to an object. So for now, I'm just going to switch this back to const, because we're not going to be overriding the overall value, so we'll just keep that there. And we've already looked at how to access update a key, but I'll go ahead and just include those examples down here again. So we could either do example.a is equal to 5, and we could do example and actually introduce a new key here and assign that to a value of 4. And you'll see over on the right that those values are changing. Let's do another console log here. And yeah, we'll just keep going down the list. So I think we already looked at how to update a key. That's what we're doing here. If you just wanted to output the value of a key, yeah, I guess let's just do that here. You could do console.log and then example.a. And that's going to just output that value of 2. Similarly, yeah, I guess here we could just show that if you wanted to add a key, you could either do it that way or do like example.c is equal to 5. And we'll see both of those values over there. And then, yeah, one thing too is because we are updating the object, all of these console.log statements are going to reflect the current state of the object and not the value at the time. So that's why the output looks a little strange over there. And here's where things get a little weird. So in order to delete a key from an object, you have to use the delete keyword and then do provide whatever the key is. So here we could delete example.c, and now you'll notice on all that output over there that C is no longer part of example. And I don't know if it'll let you do it with the square bracket syntax, but I would assume it would. Yeah, so you can also use that there. I'm going to switch it back to the dot syntax just because that's a little more standard unless you're doing something where you need to programmatically choose the keys value, which we'll look at here in a bit. Another thing you'll see is when you're defining an object, sometimes you'll see something like this where you'll have, say like const dog equals poodle and const cat equals, doesn't really matter, whatever, my cat. And then down here you can make an object that's animals. And you can just say dog, comma, cat. Oh. And you'll see over there on the right that we have an object now that has 2 keys, dog and cat, and they each have the value that was assigned up here. And so really what this is it's just a shorthand for writing out the key dog with the value dog and the key cat with the value cat. And so you'll see this syntax pretty often when you're working with modern JavaScript, where people will just do this here where they just use the shorthand. And so it's just one of those things to watch out for. And that's also a reason it's good to cover this before jumping ahead into more advanced topics like classes, just so you're familiar with kind of some of the common ways of handling and writing JavaScript. Now, another thing you can do is, in addition to writing, having values that are just values, you can have functions as the values. So up here on, let's just choose one of these, maybe animals. We could add to animals. So we'll say animals dot greet is equal to a function, and we can say let's see, what do we want to do here? We could say console.log, and then we could do this dot cat. We could say hello from this dot cat and this dot dog. And it's probably complaining about this. Oh, sorry. We want to do equals function with no arguments. This will make a little more sense in a minute. And then now we can do animals dot greet, and we will just call that. And here you can see we have hello from my cat and poodle. So it's calling this function. This is just an anonymous function that's set as the value of this key. And because we're calling it from animals, because we're doing animals.greet, the value for this is going to be the caller. That's something that's kind of unusual about JavaScript, but something that's kind of nice to understand is that essentially the caller is always passed in as this, or is always treated as this within the function. I should say, yeah, usually treated as the caller within the function, unless you do some, there's some special things you can do to circumvent that, but I'm not going to get into that here. And then similarly, you could, if you wanted to, just define this up here when you're defining animals. So instead of doing this this style assignment, we could just move this whole thing out and put it with the rest of where we're creating the object. And then you would end up with something like that. I think also now that this is declared inside of the object, I think we can get away with this. Oh no, it's not going to list. Okay. So yeah, these objects can be more than just, the values for the keys can be more than just normal values. They can also be functions. And that's important because ultimately that's kind of how, because JavaScript uses something called prototypical inheritance. Ultimately, this is kind of how instances of classes get implemented under the hood. There's some extra details about how that works, but if you understand this, it'll be easier to understand classes and JavaScript. And then similar to the shorthand above, there's some things you can do that are referred to as destructuring. And these are used a lot, especially if you end up doing like React. You'll see this a lot in React, or really just kind of like any place you're using modern JavaScript, you're likely to run into this. So imagine we got animals from somewhere else, like we made a call out to a server and it gave us back this animals object, and we wanted to get to dog and cat. What we could do is we could say like my dog and my constant my dog. That's actually not going to work. Let me try doing something slightly different here. We'll make an object called my animals, and we'll give it a key of fish, and we'll say beta fish. And what else should we give it? Bird. And we can say cardinal. So we have a key for fish and a key for bird. So we could here, if we wanted to get to fish and bird easily, actually maybe let's add a third one in here too. Snake, rattlesnake. So down here we could, out of animals, we could just we could create constants kind of directly from the keys if we want to. So here we could say constant fish and bird are equal to my animals. And when we do that, then we can do console.log fish and bird. And you'll see over there on the right that we're getting beta and cardinal for those. And so all that's doing is whatever you put in here, it's going to declare a constant with the value related to it in the object that you're referring to. So it's just mapping this fish over to beta and this bird over to cardinal. And it'll just ignore any other keys and values that you have in there. It's only going to try to pull out the ones that you specify. So yeah, one place you'll see this used a lot is when you're just passing objects around. So here we have a function called greet, and it has one parameter, which is animals. This is just an object. And then the function body inside the function body, we have a constant for fish and bird that we get from animals through destructuring. And then here we're just going to log out fish and bird in a interpolated string. And if you're not familiar with string interpolation, you just use backticks. And then if you want to drop in values, you can just use $ and curly brackets around the variables you want to use or the values you want to use. And here you can see when we call greet my animals, again, it's going to use my animals from above. And the first thing it's going to do is pull out that fish and bird. And then on the right, you can see it's going to say beta and cardinal down here in the console on the right. And that's a really common thing to do. One thing that's really nice about doing that is one problem you can have with functions is if you pass lists of arguments, the positions are important. And if those lists get long or the order needs to change or you want to set default values or anything like that, it can be a bit of a pain because you need to go update the function and all of the callers. And if you use an object for your parameters, you have a little more flexibility because each of your parameters is named with a key, and you can always just pull out exactly the keys that you want to use. So I'd say it's become a more common practice to use an object and just pull out the things that you're interested in. And it just, I wouldn't say like future proofs, but it definitely makes it easier to adjust for changes that might happen. So you'll see this pattern used a lot, the destructuring pattern used a lot at the beginning of a function. And there's some other places that you'll see it too. So one thing I wanted to take a look at here was if you want to make a copy of an object. So maybe you want to make an object that's her animals. And we'll just set that to, we want it to be, say, the exact same thing as my animals. Maybe this is, my wife's animals. So we can do that. But one thing that'll could be a little surprising is if we now change my animals and we add a pet giraffe to there. Doesn't matter. George. And then we do a console.log of her animals. We're going to see George show up here as the giraffe. And with that may be a little surprising because we've changed one object, but this other object we've declared is also updating. So what's really happening there is this is now a reference to the same object that my animals is a reference to. And I think technically in JavaScript it isn't exactly the same thing as a reference, but that's kind of how I think about it. But these are essentially pointing to this, however you want to, whatever term you want to use, they're pointing to the same object. So if you update one, you're going to update the other. And this is actually a really common source of bugs in JavaScript when people don't understand this and they just do an assignment like this and then just try to update the original object. So instead of doing that, if what you're really wanting, that's actually also a good reason to use destructuring, because that way you're guaranteeing you're just pulling out the values that you're interested in and you're getting them as new declarations and values, and so there's not a chance of accidentally updating the original object. So what you could do in this case, instead of going about it this way, I'm just going to comment this out. What you could do is you could say constant her animals is equal to, and this is called the rest operator, and you can just do ... and then you can do my animals, and what that's going to do is it's going to destructure all of my animals and assign it to her animals. At least I think it will. Oh, there it goes. I was trying to figure out why I was complaining. And then now if we do console.log of her animals, we should see all the same keys and values, but it's actually a new object. And we can just prove that out here by doing this change here with George the giraffe. And now you'll see that's updating my animals to have a giraffe key with the value of George isn't updating her animals. So So that's a really simple way to copy one object over to another. And if you want to, you can actually put in new keys and values in here. So we could do, we could add hamster, and this could be Harry the hamster. And now you'll see over here on the right, in addition to all the values we're getting from my animals, we also have a hamster here. And that's it's kind of nice. You can add in additional keys and values, or if you think of maybe even having like two sets of values from objects that you want to combine into one object, you can do things like additional REST operators here. So you could do like my animals and their animals, and then you would have, this might be, instead of her animals, this might be all animals or something like that. So it just makes it really easy to work with objects and initialize them with the values that you want them to have. And one reason this is kind of, it might seem silly, but one of the reasons that this is nice is because previously the normal way to handle doing something like this was to do something like his animals equals, and then you would do object dot assign, and you would start with an empty object, and then you would have to provide the object you were trying to copy here. And what this does is it takes an object and it transfers over all the keys and values to this object, and then sets that to be the value here. And because it's a new object, you're not at risk of accidentally updating the object you're trying to copy. But yeah, the syntax is just a little, I don't know, it's not as nice. I never like having to go back and refer to the like object in JavaScript. It just seems kind of goofy to me. So I appreciate this destructuring syntax, and I think you'll typically see this destructuring syntax used in newer code, but you are likely to run into this object.assign in other JavaScript and older code that you'll run across online. And another thing you'll want to do with objects is just probably like, iterate over them and be able to process them. So this is another area where you're going to be referring to object directly, unfortunately. But say we wanted to print out all the animals and their names. So what we could do is we could essentially say object.keys for her animals. And that's going to give us all the keys. And actually, before we do the looping, let's just take a look at this. So if we want to, we can look at all the keys for her animals. And you can see there we get back, on the right at the bottom, you can see we're getting back an array that just has entries for all of the keys. And then similarly, we can do object.values, and we'll get an array that has all the values. But if you wanted to just loop over the whole thing, you could do object.keys for her animals. And then you could do a for, different ways to do it. You could do a for each, or you could do something like a map, but let's just do for each for now. And then we will just say for each animal. And for each animal, we want to do a console.log of, and remember the animal in this case, actually let's just change it to key. So we want to output the key, and then we also want to output the value for that, and all we will do for that is just also refer back to her animals. And then here we'll use that square bracket syntax that I mentioned before, and essentially if you do square bracket and then provide a string value, it'll look up the key and give you the value back for that. So here we're just saying for her animals, given the current key, which is going to be one of these values I have my pointer over here on the right. It's going to be hamster, fish, bird, or snake. We're just going to log out that value. And you can see down here we do have the output. We have hamster, colon, hairy, and then same thing for fish, bird, and snake. And then we could do, just to show it's different from kind of the normal output, we could do a hamster called hairy, a fish called beta, a bird called cardinal, and a snake called rattlesnake. And yeah, I think that's more or less the basics on how to do this. Sometimes it's nice to break these longer things up across multiple lines, and you could even just break this into multiple lines, since that's kind of long. But yeah, this just gives you a convenient way to loop over an object's keys and values and do something with them. So yeah, I think that kind of wraps up everything I wanted to cover in this video. I think, having gone through this, and I also really encourage you to go through and actually type this out and play around with it a little bit. That's just, getting a little bit of practice and repetition will really help these ideas sink in. I know for myself, until I see something kind of fail and then work, it just never fully sinks in. It really helps me to do some practice, even if I kind of get the idea. And you build up a little bit of muscle memory too, which helps out when you're writing code in the future. But once you're feeling pretty comfortable with this, I think you'll be in a good spot to start looking into JavaScript classes and inheritance, and just kind of how some of the basic object-oriented aspects of JavaScript work. And starting to understand prototype also, which I'll cover in the same video that I cover classes in. But yeah, thanks for watching. If you liked the video, hit the like button. If you want to see more videos like this, hit subscribe and hit the notification bell to be notified when new videos come out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.